What countries would look like after WW3? World War II is over. The planet will never be the same. The southern United States now belongs to Mexico. Europe is the newest administrative province of Russia. Japan, Taiwan, and Australia are governed by Beijing. Regardless of how World War II starts, it will rewrite the borders of the map and not in the ways you might think. We are going to examine a few hypothetical scenarios for World War II and how each would result in shifting borders across the world. Some key factors must be clarified before we get started. 1. We can't possibly cover every scenario in this video, but we will examine some very intriguing outcomes based on statistical data of the most likely scenarios. 2. We will assume nuclear weapons are used in moderation, and the war doesn't escalate into a full-blown apocalyptic event. And 3. We are basing our extrapolations for the future on the information we have now and how certain nations and regimes have acted in the past. The only way that a third world war could erupt in the present day is if Russia and China combined forces and went to war against NATO. The reason for this is that neither Russia nor China is strong enough to defeat the United States and its allies alone. The reality is, even if they work together, China and Russia would likely still struggle to win an all-out war with the West. That being said, there are several scenarios where a Sino-Russian alliance could come out on top due to the massive natural resources at their disposal, the enormous size of both militaries, and China's economic stranglehold on many parts of the world. We know that the United States has the most powerful military in the world by far. We also know that NATO, on average, has better weapons and tactics than both Russia and China. However, let's examine what would happen in several different scenarios and how they could result in a shifting of borders in ways we might not expect. The two sides in World War II will be NATO and Western nations on one side, including their strategic partners and alliances around the world. This would mean that Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and parts of Latin America would also likely join this side of the battle. The opposition would be led by China and Russia, which would also include many nations with authoritarian rulers and close ties to Moscow and Beijing. This means that North Korea, Belarus, Syria, Iran, and several former Soviet bloc states will ally themselves with Russia and China. There is also a possibility that many Latin American and African countries will also throw their lot in with China in particular, the reason for which we will discuss later on in this video. NATO is made up of 31 countries, most of which are in Europe except for the United States and Canada. Similar to NATO, but by no means as powerful, is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is an alliance between Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. The CSTO has a comparable stipulation as Article 5 of the NATO agreement, numbered Article 4, which states that an attack against one member would be seen as an attack against all members of the alliance. So, if any one of the 6 nations in CSTO is invaded or forced into a war, all other nations will declare war on the aggressor. Now let's look at some World War II scenarios and see how allegiances shift and borders would change as a result. The first few might be shocking, as there will be some backstabbing between supposed allies. But as we continue with our analysis, a much more hopeful picture of the world will start to emerge. Unless you are rooting for the authoritarians to win, then you will be sorely disappointed. Scenario 1. Russia's worst nightmare. The war in Ukraine has been raging for more than a year. Putin feels the impending doom on the horizon. He takes drastic actions by launching a tactical nuke at a Ukrainian base. The low-yield nuke detonates, vaporizing the base, soldiers, and vehicles in the vicinity. However, since the nuclear device is only 25 kilotons, the blast radius is around 4 miles or 64 kilometers. The damage is not widespread, but it's the very nature of the weapon that elicits a response from NATO. They declare war on Russia and launch aircraft, conventional missiles, and soldiers at key targets across the border. NATO refrains from using nukes as they don't want to escalate things further, but Putin must be dealt with. In response to NATO's invasion, Article 4 of the Collective Security Treaty Organization was initiated. Russia has just over 1 million soldiers between their active members, including those in reserves. However, since the war began, Russia has suffered close to 200,000 casualties, so things are already looking bad for Putin. He calls on his closest allies and other authoritarian rulers to aid Russia in their fight against NATO, as once Russia is defeated, the West will spread its influence even further into the Middle East and Asia. But this is a hard sell. The fighting is contained in Eastern Europe and Russia. Many leaders don't want to paint a target on their backs, so they stay out of the conflict. Other than the CSTO countries, Iran decides to fight alongside Russia as its government's deep distrust for the West fuels its decision to escalate the conflict. Syria also joined Russia because President Bashar al-Assad is afraid that if Putin loses, he will lose his main source of weapons to control his own country. But even with aid from these other nations, there is one country whose absence cannot be ignored: China. When Russia launched a nuke, even if it was a tactical one, Beijing turned its back on Putin. China has made it very clear what its stance is around using nuclear weapons. Beijing firmly believes that nukes should only be used in the defense of one's country and never as an offensive weapon. Therefore, the nuclear bomb that Putin dropped on Ukraine sealed his fate. China refuses to come to Russia's aid. Now, instead of receiving an influx of weapons and men, China has cut off most of its support to Moscow. They still buy natural resources from Russia but refuse to send military aid. In this scenario, NATO forces quickly storm through western Russia and capture Moscow. After a year of fighting in Ukraine and the worsening conditions in the country due to heavy sanctions, the general Russian population doesn't put up much of a fight to keep Putin in power. For many, their leader has failed. The superior tanks, aircraft, and technology of NATO forces allow them to deal with any defense Russia mounts. Vladimir Putin is found dead in the Kremlin with a bullet in his head from what appears to be an assassination carried out by someone in his government. NATO would also attack any country that allied itself with Russia during the conflict, and after the war would have their governments dismantled and reorganized. So if World War II ended up being Russia fighting against NATO without the help of China, there is no chance they could win a conventional war. Even with allies in the area, too many other countries would remain neutral if China did not back Russia. This includes North Korea, who more than likely would aid Russia, but only if China permitted them. Given the scenario we just outlined, if Beijing refuses to support Russia, it will likely force North Korea to do the same. After the war was over, Russia would be broken up and new governments would be put in place. There's even a possibility that China would invade Russia from the east if Beijing thought there was a chance Putin would launch more nukes and put the world at risk of being obliterated in a nuclear holocaust. In this case, China may lay claim to some of the eastern and northern lands of Russia, as there are huge amounts of natural resources, such as fossil fuels and ore, in some of these regions. Let's imagine after Russia is defeated and forced to surrender that the country is deemed too large to control by one government, and that the stability of the region may be better maintained by splitting Russia up into 8 different countries based on the borders of its federal districts. Now, instead of one giant country, there are 8 smaller ones to manage. The maps of Asia would need to be rewritten with these new borders, and each territory would be given its name. It's plausible in this scenario that the Far Eastern and Siberian districts would come under the influence of China. Beijing would set up puppet governments in these new countries that served their interests by giving them exclusive trade deals and the rights to acquire the natural resources in the region. These nations would also serve as a buffer between China and the now pro-West nations of Western Russia. The new nations who emerge from Russia's western districts would be led by democratically elected governments. These would be overseen by NATO and would have close ties to Europe and the United States. The borders of Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan would likely remain the same, but with new governments. The Kaliningrad Oblast, which is currently a part of Russia, would likely be incorporated into Lithuania's borders rather than becoming its own country. There is also the chance that in the chaos, other players in the Middle East might take advantage of the weakened state of anyone who aided Russia. Perhaps Israel would launch an invasion of Syria to eliminate one of the threats surrounding it, secure more resources, and effectively expand its territory almost tenfold. China might take control of the Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan governments and install regimes that would ally themselves with Beijing. Soon after the nuclear bombs and missiles stopped falling, the smoke, soot, and debris kicked up by the nuclear explosions would begin blocking the sun. It would spread to the southern hemisphere, making the entire planet all but inhospitable. So if World War II results in nuclear war, we can just forget about any borders or governments, as the human species as a whole would struggle to survive. Do you like it? Kindly give your valuable response in our comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting and informative